Wow, here we are, ready to wrap up Chapter 11, talking about water. Today, for Section 3, we're going to talk about water pollution. Your essential question: what are 5 different types of water pollution? A lot of ways it can happen, but can you identify 5 types and kind of tell us what they are? Water pollution is the introduction into water of any kind of waste matter, materials, chemicals that are harmful to organisms that are living in it, exposed to it, or are going to drink it. So kind of a broad spectrum, if you will, but anything that's going to degrade the water quality to the point that it's going to harm something that's existing off of it, that needs it. Now, almost all the ways that you and I, that humans use water, contribute to water pollution. However, all that being said, the main 2 underlying causes are industrialization and our rapid population growth. So many people on the planet that it just winds up overwhelming things, and everybody says, oh, this little bit of trash doesn't matter. There's almost 8 billion people on the planet, and every little thing we toss out adds up. It really does matter. Now, developed countries, we talk about things like developed and less developed. Developed countries have really made great strides in cleaning up a lot of the polluted waterways. Here in the United States in the 70s, we really started making big headways. We had big goals by the 80s for it all to be clear. We're not necessarily there, but we have come a long way in educating our population and not just throw trash in and to create fines for companies that do it. We've come a long way to get a lot of our waterways clean. But in a lot of the less developed countries, water pollution is a huge problem. Because a lot of times the only water people have accessible to them to go and get to drink is polluted. It's been contaminated by, you name it, people throwing things out, companies, big corporations, or just regular people throwing things into it. Whether it's sewage, just literally human waste, animal waste, agricultural runoff, fertilizers, pesticides, all of these just get dumped into the surface water, the streams, which many of the developing or the less developed countries depend on for their drinking water. So pollution in general, very broad terms, comes from 2 sources: point source and non-point source. So let's address what we mean by those. First off, point source. I literally remember this one by, you did it, he did it. Literally, if I can point my finger and say it's coming from there, it's point source. And this is what most of us think about. Ooh, that factory is dumping waste into the river. That truck pulled up and dumped waste into the river. Point source, we know that it's happening. Look, that tanker has a leak in it and you can see an oil trail following it in the ocean. Point source. We know exactly where it comes from. All of this pollution is discharged from a single source, and we know what it is. Although we can identify point source, we know it's that factory, we know it's that ship, we know it's that company, we know it's, you get the idea. It can be very difficult to enforce. When we looked at these Superfund sites in the beginning of the year, we know exactly who was there, but they've now gone bankrupt. They were supposed to clean it up. They say, we're bankrupt and we don't have enough money to do it, and the problem still exists. So a lot of times we can look at it and say, like in the picture back here, yep, you did it. This was a mine leak. The back wall of a mine went out, and all of the chemicals that they were using to leach out the minerals leaked into the river. And you can see one side and the other. Now, this isn't one side or the other. This is a before and after. The river used to look like it did on the left, and then they had the leak. It now went back to the other, but all this chemicals went into the river and washed its way all the way down into the ocean, destroying everything kind of on its path. classic point source. We know exactly where it came from, but it's not so easy to go and clean that up. It's down in the river and we can't just go grab it, stop it. So even if we know it's point source, it can still be difficult to deal with. And this takes us to non-point source. Where is it coming from? I can't point my finger. It's coming from a lot of different sources. A lot of times, non-point source pollution is you and me. My car leaks a little bit of oil. It's not enough to really take it in or get it fixed, but every so often I have to add more oil. Well, those little bits of oil are leaking onto the ground, then it washes into the river. And I say, well, it's not much, it doesn't really matter. But lots of people's cars are doing the same thing. I haven't had my car worked on in a while, and a little bit of exhaust is coming out the back. Well, that's oil coming out, and then it settles on the ground. Non-point pollution. We get fertilizer runoff, and a lot of times it's coming from your yard, my yard, my neighbor's yard, because I put a little too much fertilizer. I fertilized right before it rained, and then it ran into it. It's non-point. We know it's coming from you and me, but it's really hard to find people or go after it. It's accumulation of really small amounts of pollution, but from a whole bunch of sources, and it adds up to be a lot. And controlling non-point solution depends on public awareness. It's education. You have to realize what you're doing can be a problem. I have to realize what I'm doing can be a problem. I realize I need to keep my car maintenance so it's leak-free, because all these leaks wind up being a big problem. Once again, if you look at the picture back here, this is a Yoplait container. It's 40 years old. Somebody pitched it out and it stayed in the ocean and washed up. It looks brand new. You know we have a problem when 40-year-old plastic is washing up and it looks like it's brand new. That stuff sticks around practically forever. It's not truly forever, but hundreds of years is a long time when we're all throwing away little bits and it accumulates. You look around the roads and the streets sometimes, and there's quite a good accumulation out there, even though we try to pick it up. All right, this is going to take us to wastewater, right? I flush it down the toilet. I wash it down the sink. I put it in the washing machine and wastewater, right? It disappears. I take a bath and I pull the plug and it goes out. Wastewater. Well, it goes through a series of sewage pipes that carry it along with everything else into a wastewater treatment facility. So it contains waste of some kind from my home, a business, an industry, the school that you might be in, what have you. Now at a wastewater treatment plant, all the stuff comes in and the water gets filtered. The water gets filtered to clean out as much of the particulate matter as we can. And we want to get it clean enough to return it to a river. That's the ultimate goal. We use the water, we flush the water, it runs down the drains, and we want to clean it up before putting it in a river. We need to get it kind of safe again. Now, most of the wastewater from our homes contains a lot of biodegradable material, and it can be broken down by living organisms. Soap, right? Soap, grease, hair, it washes in the drain, etc. We wash our dishes and little bits of food. Well, a lot of this is biodegradable. It'll break down, and even if it's poop or pee, we're flushing it, well, it's still biodegradable. Little critters, biological matter, bacteria will break it down. Paper bits, toilet paper, what have you. This will all break down so we can. But some of it is not biodegradable. A lot of it we can filter out and it'll take care of itself. But some stuff isn't. Some of our stormwater runoff actually contains toxic substances. Once again, like this oil I talked about, or gasoline from the car, lots of whatever's out on the street, washing into the storm drains. Some of that stuff is pretty nasty stuff, and it can't get removed just by the standard treatment. But ultimately, what happens is we wind up with sewer sludge. In a sense, what we do is we take this stuff, we put it down in a tank, we filter out what we can, and then you've got stuff in the tank, and then we let the water cycle do its thing. We just kind of stir it up and let it evaporate. But eventually the water will evaporate and it goes back into the water cycle. Pure water is evaporating, but we're left with sludge. And sometimes that sludge has pretty dangerous concentrations of toxic chemicals. And if it does, then it has to get disposed as hazardous waste. And this sewer sludge is a pretty big expense for cities to deal with. You can imagine the amount of solid waste, even a city the size of Gainesville, which isn't that big, would accumulate in a year. Everything that's going down, we're flushing in our toilets, going out, it's a lot. So it's enormous, and we have to deal with it in some shape, form, or fashion. Now, a sewer sludge just looks like this, right? It looks like kind of dirt almost, or poop. Sometimes it sort of is. It's all this waste material that just doesn't break down. And we're having to look for ways to get rid of it. Now, if the sludge is high quality, we can use it as fertilizer, and we do. It has to be tested. If the sludge does not have high levels of toxic chemicals or mercury or lead or problem things, then we can actually use it as fertilizer. We put it in compost, and this is a good use of it. However, sometimes it's not good enough to be used for fertilizer. If it truly isn't toxic, we can turn it into bricks. So it's not good for fertilizer, but maybe, quality B sludge, we can use it to put into bricks. Once again, cities have lots of buildings they have to build, they have to upkeep, schools, jails, offices, courts, all this are city buildings. So the bricks can be put to good use. But the sort of final one is if it's really bad. Sometimes it just simply has to be treated as hazardous waste, possibly burned, taken care of, and once again, it's an expensive problem. Another form of water pollution is eutrophication. Too many nutrients, right? We have natural eutrophication, but we also have artificial eutrophication, sometimes known as cultural eutrophication. Because of our culture, putting fertilizer and things out, we're eutrophying some of the rivers. Now, most of the nutrients in the water system just come from organic matter. Leaves, animal waste, poop, an animal dies, what have you. And it just gets broken down into mineral nutrients. This is normal, natural process, happens all the time. I talk about my koi pond. I have to fight against it becoming eutrophied, becoming a eutrophic pond. And I have to clean all that stuff out from time to time. It's a natural process. But these nutrients are a part of any aquatic ecosystem, but if they wind up getting too much of a good thing, it becomes a bad thing. And we just refer to this as artificial eutrophication. When we are adding chemicals, by and large, nitrates and phosphates into it as well. Because eutrophication is happening. The leaves are falling, the grass stems are breaking off, animals are dying. And when it rains, all these nutrients make their way into the rivers, the streams, the creeks, the lakes, the wetlands, and they need the nutrients for the plants to grow. But too much of a good thing winds up growing too much algae. We get too much algae, the bacteria come in, the bacteria suck up all the oxygen, and the other things in the water die. Water pollution, right? Anything that degrades the water system to the point that the things living in it or living from it get harmed or die. So eutrophication is a form of water pollution. Once these plants in the soil begin to grow, the shallow waters fill in, and we wind up getting eutrophication. This lake becomes a swamp in time because all the matter builds and packs up. And the more nutrients we're putting into the system, the faster this can occur and damage can occur. So it's this aspect of it being accelerated, which is what we're really talking about. Eutrophication is a natural, normal process, but when it gets sped up because of our culture, adding fertilizers, laundry detergents have phosphates in them. Nitrates and phosphates are two of the things that go into fertilizer, and they really help a plant life grow tremendously. Another form, completely different and something we don't think about, is thermal pollution. Remember, we've talked about power plants. And power plants take enormous amounts of water. We have to run the water through the power plant to help cool it down. Well, typically we have a river coming by and you got a power plant here. So we're pulling water out of the river here. It goes by the power plant that's cooling the power plant off, which means it's warming up the water, and then we're dumping the water out down here. It's clean. We didn't do anything to the water except for warm it up a bit. We didn't add any chemicals, no pollutants, just heat. However, that can have a very harmful effect on the water quality. We've talked about before that when oxygen is in water, oxygen-rich water tends to be cool. Cold water can hold more oxygen in it than warm water. So this oxygen, or at least more oxygen-rich water comes in. As it warms up, a lot of the oxygen comes out, bubbles out of the water, and we're dumping it down here with less oxygen in it. And some fish and organisms now can't survive. They can live up here where it's cool. They can't live down here where it's warm. So it's thermal pollution. Anything that is changing the water quality to the point the organisms living in it or from it are harmed. So it's thermal pollution. As this water gets warmed up and it's constant, it can disrupt the ecosystem. And anything that disrupts our ecosystem affects the food chain. Anything affecting the food chain or the food web causes problems. Taking us to groundwater pollution. We have surface water, which is largely what we've been talking about: creeks, rivers, streams, lakes, wetlands. Well, a lot of our water that we depend on is groundwater. We're pumping it up out of the ground. Here in Florida, we pump our water out from aquifers, or it literally bubbles up out of the ground in our springs all around us that we use. So, if pollutants enter the groundwater, then we have a serious problem, because once it makes its way down into the aquifer, it's really difficult to clean it out. Now, we have pesticides that we're using on our lawns, on our farms, herbicides designed to kill plants, the chemical fertilizers, gas, petroleum, oil. Any of these things are common groundwater pollutants. They get into our system, they float into and they sink down through the ground, and these pollutants make their way into our aquifers. And once they get in the aquifer, it's incredibly difficult to get out. We also have a lot of storage tanks underground, like a septic tank. Some houses have a septic tank. It doesn't go to the city water, it sits in this big tank. Well, if that tank gets a leak in it, well, it's just leaking into the ground. And it's really hard to know if you have a leak in a tank. Our oil gets stored underground a lot of times. Our gasoline is stored underground all the time. These things develop leaks. And a lot of times they can't be repaired or even replaced until we know there's a problem. We don't realize it until, oh wait, we've got pollution in the groundwater. Then we go and find the source. Once again, point source or non-point source. Sometimes it's hard to tell where they are. Now, a lot of our modern tanks have been designed, have been encased in cement as well, but there's still a lot of old tanks out there and they leak down into the ground. Groundwater pollution. We learned about this in our Superfund sites. A lot of the Superfund sites had groundwater problems. It is one of the most challenging environmental problems in the world because groundwater recharges so slowly. Decades to centuries to fill an aquifer. So if it's polluted, about all we could do is we could pump all the water out. We can do that. We can turn the pumps on, pump all the water out. But it can take hundreds of years for that water to fill back up. And if the pollutants are still in the soil, it's still going to be polluted when it gets down in there, because that pollution will cling into the rocks and soil and everything. I mean, you can imagine if you have a tank and it has lots of mud and dirt in it, if you just pump the water but you add more water in, it's still going to be dirty and polluted. You got to get that whole thing cleaned out. And it's not like we can crawl down into an aquifer and scrub it. So once these things get polluted, it can be incredibly difficult. Once again, One of the biggest environmental problems we have is the pollution of groundwater. And this takes us to ocean pollution. Now, unfortunately, a lot of times pollutants are dumped directly into the ocean. For instance, ships can legally dump their wastewater and garbage overboard. It's a legal system. Instead of having a latrine, they can just put their waste right in. Trash, they can throw it straight over into the ocean. Legal in most countries. Now, a lot of our oceans are also international water. There's nobody regulating, in a sense, what's happening. However, even though that occurs, 85% of our ocean pollution, such as toxic oil waste, medical waste, comes from activities on land, right here. Because whatever we do here tends to make its way down into the ocean. And a lot of our really sensitive coastal ecosystems, like coral reefs, are the ones that are most affected by pollution because they're incredibly sensitive. Now, oil spills. Normally we talk about the ocean, we kind of immediately think about oil spills. These are bad ones. And each year, somewhere in the neighborhood of 37 million gallons of oil from tankers actually spill into the ocean. Whether it's a big tanker that breaks open and spills, or it's a small leak, as far as it goes. We really, there's a small hole in the hull and it's leaking out. And even just putting the oil in, some of it spills out. Anyway, 37 million gallons a year. And these oil spills can have a very dramatic effect, but they're actually only a very small percentage of the oil pollution. Most of it that is in the ocean, once again, you and me. It's activities on land that runs off into the ocean. If we could limit these non-point sources of pollution, it would go an awful long way to clearing up our oceans. That's education, and you and me striving to do better is what it takes. So when we talk about water pollution and ecosystems, water pollution can cause an immediate damage to an ecosystem. Once again, oil tanker goes, and all of a sudden this whole thing is gone to pot, right? It's no good anymore. The shrimp are dying, the fish are dying, the birds are dying. Nothing can survive until it gets cleaned up. And it can be a decade before a environment can heal from a damage. But these effects can also be very far reaching because some of these things build up in the environment because they don't decompose quickly. This is the term biomagnification. Biomagnification. This is when we get some sort of chemical in the environment and it doesn't break down. And then as things eat it or consume it, it raises up the food chain. So there's a little bit in it here, but the things that eat it, they're eating a bunch of them. And then there's more pollutants in this, and then the bird that's eating them winds up with toxic levels. Biomagnification. And it has alarming consequences for things at the top of the food chain. And this is why the US states limit how much fish you eat from certain areas. They'll put things, don't eat more than 2 catfish a year from this lake or this stream. Don't eat more than 1 a week, whatever it might be, because they're trying to take into account biomagnification. And you and I, we're at the top of the food chain. So if some of these chemicals get into the environment, well, they can stay in the environment for long times, decades even. And we have to be very careful of eating things that are in an environment that has been exposed to some of these toxic chemicals. We want to try and clean up our act, if you will, right? We want to have our waterways clear. We want them to be healthy as much as we can. In 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed, and this was designed specifically to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waters. That was the goal. We actually wanted to make all surface water clean, to be clean enough for fishing and swimming by 1983. It was not achieved, but a lot of progress has been made. And most of our waterways are clean enough for swimming and fishing. We simply don't want to stop until they're all clean enough. for swimming and fishing, where we could catch the fish and eat them. We want our waterways to be clean. Now, the percentage of lakes that are fit for it has increased by over 30%, and a lot of states have passed even stricter laws. And these are things we want to get behind. When it comes time to vote, as many of you are going to be ready to vote in just a few years, sometimes these environmental issues on the ballot box are sometimes some of the most important votes we'll cast. Well, guys, that wraps it up for the chapter on water, and specifically today on water pollution. I hope you get involved, think about it, act wisely, and we'll see you next time.